So this goes back to when Bill Gates first made the video concerning the discovery of this process where Earth was considerably more massive, brighter, and hotter. It was very much like the sun. And the moon was its own object, its own star itself. Now in Bill Gates' video back in 2011, it had the moon shining brightly. Of course, but I'm not too sure if it was shining brightly when it was orbiting the Earth. I think possibly it was already moved well into hot Jupiter stages. Or it could have been an object a little bit more massive than its current mass and was ablated away by the young hot Earth when the Earth had grabbed it. This being said, the new paper, Stellar Metamorphosis, an alternative to the giant impact hypothesis for moon formation, overviews this point. The abstract goes, an ad hoc proposition was made by scientists to form the moon. In it, they state that the Earth was hit by an incredibly massive object, which then the moon formed out of as a giant blob of shrapnel. They hypothesized that in order to create the moon, another object called Theia was needed, which is of course an object that has never been observed, as well as a process that has never been observed. Alternatively, if stellar metamorphosis is used, the moon can be explained as well as Venus's lack of one, in accordance to the observations found in the age of exoplanets. And the main hypothesis here is that, for those who are new to the theory, is that stars and planets are not mutually exclusive. The star is the young, hot planet, which then cools, collapses gravitationally, and forms the planet in its internal regions. And we can reverse engineer the size of the planet when it's in a rocky structure, as well as the amount of differentiation inside that planet to determine its past history. For instance, the moon, and I have this in the paper here, the moon has a very small iron core relative to the Earth's iron core. What that means in this diagram, and Baz is making a new video on this, it's going to take a little while because it's a lot of computer graphic stuff. It's far over my head. But yeah, Baz is making a video where we can determine how large the iron cores form when they evolve. So for instance, if a star evolves slowly, which is up here, it will have a large iron core. If it evolves fast, loses its atmosphere fast, then it will fall down below the Taylor threshold, which is that little red line, reddish purplish line, and it will not form life. It'll just form really quickly. All the material that it can deposit into the interior of the star will be in a much smaller amount. So to look at the moon and say, well, its iron core is much smaller relatively to the Earth's iron core, what that tells us is that when the moon was forming, the moon formed a lot quicker than the Earth, which means, well, it means a lot of things, but in particular for this alternative, what I think happened is that the Earth, when the Earth was very hot and bright and young, it had captured a lot of objects. Now, we're not just talking about the moon here. There are a lot of objects that orbited the Earth in the past. Of course, this is far beyond what the dogma accepts, because they can't even accept the fact that planets and stars are actually the same things. But once you move past that blockade in their minds, and you go and you see nature for what it really is, you know, due to the observations we have of stars cooling and collapsing and becoming planets, you realize that the Earth had a lot of other objects orbiting it because it had a lot more mass. And throughout this time of Earth having a lot of other objects orbiting it, it lost those objects because they evolved and were ejected out of the Earth star system. As well, the objects that would have stayed with the Earth as the Earth was losing its mass would have probably been dead, small, rocky objects that couldn't be ablated away like a gas giant could. As well, they should have been orbiting really, really close. Like I'd say within about a day or less orbital time, so which means the moon in Earth's past was orbiting the Earth when the Earth was a much larger, hotter star, easily within a day or two, even less, maybe a couple hours of an orbital year. And that's pretty fantastic, because then we can take that information and we can realize, well, if this were true, then the side of the moon would have been facing the Earth would be large lava seas. And those lava seas would erase all the cratering on the surface, depending on where it was orbiting. And that's pretty interesting, because when you look at the moon, it isn't one large flat sea. It's a multitude of flat areas where the lava was prevalent and erasing all the cratering. And on the back end of the moon, you'll have a lot of cratering, and you won't find very many lava sea areas at all. And it's kind of interesting, because if you take the moon and you have it orbiting in a really tight, tortuous orbit around the Earth star, then what that means is that the Earth star was pulling in all these objects from around the galaxy, and the moon was stuck in this tight orbit, spinning really fast, and it was getting hit by all these objects on its back end, because the Earth was just pulling all this crap in. And the moon was in a pretty sucky position, because it couldn't escape. It's stuck there on the back end, and then it just remained there for a long period of time, and it's just been there for a very, 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 very long time. It's been in orbit around the Earth far beyond what astronomers can imagine, meaning it wasn't created in the orbit that it currently resides in. Earth didn't capture it in any capture event. When the Earth was its current size, it was much more massive. It had much more mass to work with. As well, there were other objects that were orbiting the Earth in the past that allowed for the three-body problem to pan out, so angular momentum could be transferred. Not only that, but this also answers the fact that why Venus doesn't have any moons, because Venus is a dead star. Venus would sit probably around on that phase curve right there. Where's Venus? Right there. And it's a lot older than the Earth. It's a couple billion years older than the Earth. And that being said, with Venus being older than the Earth by a few billions of years, you can take how far the moon is moving away from the Earth, and you can extrapolate when the Earth is eventually going to lose the moon. The moon's going to be lost. The Earth isn't going to have the moon in its tight orbit forever, because the Earth doesn't have the mass to hold on to it anymore. And the moon has been slowly moving away from the Earth ever since the Earth was losing its mass. So then you could also take that information, and you could also reverse how much mass the Earth has lost. But then again, there's a lot of other variables to account for. But that being said, with Venus, of course Venus doesn't have any moons. They have been lost long, long, long ago. Because Venus is vastly older than the Earth. That's the Earth's fate. It's going to be just like Venus, about the same size, with a thick carbon dioxide atmosphere, because there's no carbon cycle. There's no water oceans to absorb the carbon and keep things on an even keel. When the Earth loses its water, we're screwed. But yeah, Venus as well. And you can also extrapolate too, that Venus itself, it's so old, so incredibly ancient, that it itself had its own solar system as well. And that's another thing where astronomers, they can't really imagine that, because they still separate the dead stars from the young stars, and they call the dead stars planets and the young stars stars. So it's beyond their imagination, and that's what I want to make sure that my listeners realize, is that astronomers, they don't have the mindset it takes to understand nature in its full grand form, because they're being taught into a world, they're being conditioned into a worldview that's currently, from my opinion, out of date. And that being said, it's also good to look at how things have changed over the past too, to make sure that you're being kind to people as this transition is taking place. I don't want to be labeled as, somebody who's like super arrogant and is full of themselves, because I'm not really. It's just frustrating seeing this information and then juxtaposing it to what they're currently still teaching in college and seeing all the problems, and they can be solved with it if they take just one assumption away. And I'm reading books like this now. This is what I'm reading, The Man Who Found Time, James Hutton. And in it, I'm reading about, why, the early creationists, why they considered the earth to be 6,000 years old, and their justifications based off of, and these are scholars. This isn't just like random people making stuff up. Young earth creationism was taught to even Darwin at Cambridge University. It was still popular back in like the 1800s. So, it's easy to look at the past with our viewpoint and think, oh, well, these people were just stupid. No, these were really brilliant people who made excellent justifications for their belief systems. And to see how the things have changed from that past, from young earth creationism to the realization that earth is ancient, now we're making another transition from not only is the earth ancient, but there's a reason why it's ancient. And it's ancient not only in its own specific time and place, but other objects that are in the solar system as well are also just as ancient, if not more so, than the earth. And that's where I'm headed. All right, I'll link this paper to the bottom of the page, and read books like this. It's good to get a background of how ideas change and transform over time. All right, guys, later.